So, a fistful of dice. This is a reply to your video, the Game Mastery one on social skills versus RP. I realize I'm a little bit late on this. I think it was about a week ago most of this was coming out. But I intentionally like to wait until other opinions have been brought out, especially on issues that everybody has some thoughts on, because I know I'll be offering something very different, and that's typically my place. So the basic question that you put out was how to balance the role play versus the roll of the dice, the points spent on the character versus the play that happens in game, and how this compares with other skills, which was brought up by others as well. In fact, you had some fantastic replies. Artistic Soul talked about bonus and negatives based upon the adept players, and he also brought up a very good point that some people who play these games are not necessarily good at playing the types of characters that they're interested in doing. So that's a factor in there as well. PhD&D brought up some points about failing before you begin versus same old G succeeding before you begin. Basically that if a player doesn't play the role well enough, then they don't get to make the roll of the dice anyway, and same old G says that if you've role played it out well enough, we're not going to make you roll the dice to begin with. Now, Sean Driscoll had a elaborate and fantastic example of an ongoing situation that just got more and more zany by the end, but he brought up some excellent points with it, such as people don't want to roleplay out a scene if they already know how it's going to end, which I understand. He also suggested adjusting the roll as you go. You know, you need an extra point or two, well, let's escalate the situation. And of course, that reputation he brought in at the end could matter as well. And these are all excellent points. We can compare that as well with Don Forge Cast, who he offered more specific advice. He defined the terms, but he said, you know, in this social situation, I deal with this. His was very indicative of how to deal with this in terms of the social contract in play. He also brought up the social skills used against players, which is a really prickly topic that I'm going to stay away from here. So, after we've talked about everything that's been brought out, let's go on to what I think of things. Social interaction is probably the most difficult aspect of the game to put mechanics to, and some people don't entirely. Sean Connors, for example, in the game that he's designing, intentionally did not want to have a charisma skill. And I think that whenever people say that, or when people complain about, or I don't even want to say complain, discuss different ways of doing these types of skills in game, what they are really telling me is, I don't like the emergent behaviors that happen because of these types of rules put into play. I don't like to see people use a dice as a way to not have to roleplay, or to have the dice detract from the actual experience that we're having at the table. And we have to understand that that basically means that the system that you're using probably isn't working for you in regards to the social aspect of gaming. The solution to this is kind of obvious. You can remove that system entirely and say we're not going to have any social roles, as Sean Connors has done. There are too many Seans, I believe. There's also the option of saying, what do I want to get out of this type of game? What type of experience do we want to bring up, and what types of behaviors do we want involved in these social interactions? And find a system that works for that. So here's a few examples. Now, the way Don Forgecast was describing the way that bluff versus intimidate versus diplomacy kind of have all different social barbs and attacks and ways to work against each other, kind of reminds me of the Burning Wheel mechanic Duel of Wits that actually treats social interaction as combat. There are multiple rounds, you have a body of argument, you bring it down, kind of like hit points, and there is a whole system of, at the end of it, if you've brought down somebody's body of argument but you've lost, then they have to make some concession to you because you've made a good point. So that brings out its own style of play. That brings out an argument. That brings out a debate, a discourse between the different parties involved. There are good things and there are bad things about this because it can drag out the experience longer than it would naturally have to happen, especially if the dice rolls just aren't coming up enough that bodies of argument are being reduced. So it's not perfect, but it is a much more interesting way for a lot of people to handle it. The one I really like, though, is Apocalypse World. Now, Apocalypse World has two kind of social skills. They have Read a Person, and they have Seduce or Manipulate, which is kind of the same thing, but it just has different rules. Now, Seduce or Manipulate is very simple. If you are successful, you can say, if you go along with what I want you to do, you get experience. Or you have to roll, and basically you have to succeed at your own roll to not do what I'm forcing you to do. Or if I did really well, you have to do both. You know, you get experience if you do it, and if you don't do it, you have to fight against the pressure that I'm putting on you. And that never takes away someone's personal authority toward doing something, but it makes it kind of interesting. There's also, of course, the example that if you don't do it terribly well, you might have to pay them a favor right away. You have to make some assurance to them. You know, I will only go along with you if you put your guns down right now. Whatever the case might be. And Read a Person, I think, is really the most interesting one. It allows you to ask the other person questions, straight out, player to player, about the situation going on. An example of this: how could I get you to do this? What is a threat to me right now? Etc. You can really enhance the social experience, as far as I'm concerned, make it a much more deep conversation. And it allows the player to play out the scene a little bit better. But what this really comes down to is saying, what do you want to have happen? Do you want these to be very deeply personal conversations, like Apocalypse World? Then maybe you should be looking at a system like that. Do you want it to be a debate, a discourse? Well, then look at Burning Wheel. Or there's a plethora of other systems that have very interesting ideas on how to handle these types of situations. And I would encourage you to really look at your games and say, what do I want from these mechanics, and how can I get it? Anyway, it's been a fantastic debate on this, and I thank you very much for bringing up the question in the first place.